Albert Einstein once advised, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. Einstein intuited what journalists, social scientists, authors, and artists know well. Humanity and storytelling are inseparable. Stories define us and help us understand our surroundings. Stories engage us and inspire us. But more than this, stories both connect and divide us. Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the UK, teaches to know who we are is to understand of which story or stories we're a part. This evening I want to talk about stories, because as 5779 draws to a close, I suspect many of us have had some trouble recently locating our Jewish story within the American story. Where do we fit in? To what are we connected? From whose stories are we excluded? What are the consequences of this connectivity or exclusion? I started thinking about stories after reading Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens. Harari says that what distinguishes humanity from the rest of the animal kingdom is our ability to create mythologies, hold and transmit abstract concepts, and construct shared narratives. Despite Harari's unfortunate conflation of narrative and fiction, and therefore his wholesale dismissal of religious belief, he illustrates a central truth of human thriving. Beginning about 70,000 years ago, human beings became the world's best and only storytellers. Plenty of other species have languages, of course. The difference is that so far as we can tell, none of those species tell stories. Many animals, he writes, could previously say, "Careful, a lion." But thanks to the cognitive revolution, Homo sapiens acquired the ability to say, "The lion is the guardian spirit of our tribe." This ability to create shared narratives also allows us to collaborate in extraordinary numbers. Social scientists tell us that dozens of people can, through personal interactions, form a cohesive group. But large groups, thousands or even millions, need shared belief in something greater. That can be faith in God, or the core Jewish narrative of the Exodus. But the same idea applies to nation states, systems of law, or commerce. When I take out my iPhone and Venmo you the $20 that I owe you, you and I have placed our faith in everything from Apple's cloud-based technology to the existence of a country called the United States, to a state called New York, which hosts something we've agreed is called a stock exchange, to the notion of a publicly traded corporation called Apple, and another called Venmo, and its parent company PayPal, to the very concept of money. Modern business people and lawyers are, in fact, powerful sorcerers, says Harari. The principal difference between them and tribal shamans is that modern lawyers tell far stranger tales. Stories, shared narratives, whether they seem strange or completely normal, are principally about connectedness and belonging. But as Abraham Maslow points out, it's hard to focus on the higher need of love and belonging when more basic needs like survival are in question. This past year, as you know, was a year of unprecedented violence against American Jews and Jewish institutions, synagogues in particular. Many rabbis are speaking this High Holy Day season about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism takes shape in the stories the haters tell about us. But Yom Kippur is mostly an occasion for introspection. I don't want to waste my breath on them, the anti-Semites today. I don't want to retread the stereotypes, the canards and the libels that they tell about us, the way they've inverted or perverted our proclivity for justice, our embrace of the stranger. I don't want to discuss how they've appropriated our books and weaponized them against us, or again and again and again questioned our loyalty. I don't want to delve into whataboutism and dignify the debate about which particular brand of anti-Semitism is the most virulent or dangerous. Deborah Lipstadt has made the case that all anti-Semitism relates to one or more of three things: power, money, and intelligence. Put succinctly, anti-Semitism is about the false stories various theys, tell about us. But this Yom Kippur, in this national moment, I want to discuss instead the stories that we tell about ourselves. Storytelling is encoded in our Tanakh, and stories permeate rabbinic, Kabbalistic, and Hasidic literature. But the Torah is even more explicit about the role of storytelling. V'haya ki tavo el haaretz, when you enter the land. Ve'anita va'amarta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, arami oved avi, v'yared mitzrayma v'yagor sham. You shall then recite the following before the Lord your God. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and a populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us, and they oppressed us. A central commandment of the Torah is to tell our core narrative, the story of our people. Muslims and some Christians describe us as a people of the book, but more than Am HaSefer, we are Am HaSipur, a people of the story. Sachs calls us a nation of storytellers. But here's the problem, of course. We Jews, we have lots of stories. We're like the opposite of a hive mind. 2 Jews, 3 opinions, 4 shuls, 1 story? Fat chance. Now, to be fair, we're not unique as a minority in this regard. W.E.B. Du Bois writes about what he calls African-American two-ness. It is a particular sensation, this double consciousness, he writes in 1903, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, 2 souls, 2 thoughts, 2 unreconciled strivings, 2 warring ideals in one dark body. We Jews, too, are torn, but differently, along different seams. Now, on one hand, to be conflicted is in our nature. We are Am Yisrael, God wrestlers. Conflict without and within is baked into our being. But on the other hand, we never know quite where we fit in, do we? The irony is Jews, having suffered and thrived in societies across the world, even when we've been at the center of various dramas, are almost always relegated to supporting roles. The stories we tell about ourselves are a midrash of sorts on other people's stories. Whether as Jewish communities in diaspora or Israel among the community of nations, we're always trying to understand how our Jewish storyline fits into majority national contexts and cultures. How many of you kept track of Space IL's attempt to land a craft on the surface of the moon this past April? Watching that? The excitement of the whole thing, the heartbreak that my kids and I felt when Bereshit crash-landed on the moon, belied a substantial angst, I think. The notion that tiny Israel, Jewish Israel, could become the 4th nation to accomplish that feat was at once mesmerizing and, if I'm honest, just a little pathological. Who are we? The Jewish nation, the Jewish people, on the 50th anniversary of the American lunar landing. What exactly are we trying to scribble in the margins of world history's most significant volumes? Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik has an interesting take on Jews and the stories we tell about our national identity. He cites a famous, perhaps infamous Talmudic story in which someone comes to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi with the following question. Let's say someone has 2 heads. Really, this is in the Talmud. Let's say someone has 2 heads. Now, what do you think the question's going to be? Which one do You put your tefillin on, of course. You really can't make this stuff up. But Soloveitchik, his response is novel. It depends, he says. Is this one person with two heads or two people with one body? And then he relates this implausible metaphor to the plight of world Jewry. Are we multiple heads on the same nation, or are we different people somehow joined at the hip? There is a way to know, says the Rav. Pour boiling water on one of the heads and see how Jews react somewhere else in the world. In other words, what is the story we tell ourselves about other people around the world who share our name? Harari, the Israeli author of *Sapiens*, includes this story about the days leading up to the very first moon landing in his book. The Apollo 11 astronauts trained in a remote moon-like desert in the western United States. The area is home to several Native American communities, and there is a story, or perhaps a legend, describing an encounter between the astronauts and one of the locals. One day, as they were training, the astronauts came across an old Native American. The man asked them what they were doing there. They replied that they were part of a research expedition that would shortly travel to explore the moon. When the old man heard that, he fell silent for a few moments and then asked the astronauts if they could do him a favor. "What do you want?" they asked. "Well," said the old man, "the people of my tribe believe that holy spirits live on the moon. I was wondering if you could pass on an important message to them from my people." "What's the message?" asked the astronauts. The man uttered something in his tribal language and then asked the astronauts to repeat it again and again until they had memorized it correctly. "What does it mean?" asked the astronauts. "Oh, I cannot tell you. It's a secret that only our tribe and the moon spirits are allowed to know." Well, when they returned to their base, the astronauts searched and searched until they found someone who could speak the tribal language, and they asked him to translate the secret message. When they repeated what they had memorized, the translator started to laugh uproariously. The man explained the sentence they had memorized so carefully meant, "Don't believe a single word these people are telling you. They have come to steal your lands." So let's unpack this for a moment. Who is the hero of the story? You might think it's the astronauts, the brave men on their way to the moon. But the tale undercuts their bravery by reminding us that exploring new frontiers is rarely about adventure pure and simple. Let's not forget the space race that led to the Apollo moon landing 50 years ago was an extension of the Cold War. It was the cosmic equivalent of two guys in a bar brawl saying, "Let's take this outside the planet." Now, we American Jews, not so different from American Indians perhaps, using a narrative of suffering to undercut or problematize simplistic tales, also need to rediscover, I would suggest, our narrative voice. Anti-Semites speak about us in the third person, but what is our first person narrative? What stories do we, Jews, tell about ourselves? Are we astronauts, or natives, or moon gods? Where do we fit in the American story of wanderlust or manifest destiny? Perhaps our confusion, as Alexander Kay of Brandeis has suggested, is that American Jews showed up in a country in which there is another other, on which the country was founded. In Europe, before the Enlightenment, at least we knew where we stood. After the Shoah, we definitely knew. In America, after 70 years of post-war Jewish thriving, for those of us who could pass, of white-skin privilege and widespread acceptance, not only do we not know how to be an other, we seem to have forgotten why or how or if we're supposed to be. "My father was a fugitive Aramean" begins the core Jewish story. Our central narrative is one of rootlessness. Yes, God shows up to save the day, to end our suffering, to lead us to salvation, to bring us home. But this also means that when we are not home and then some murderous thug reminds us of that, we relive to some extent that original trauma. And how we relive it, how we frame it, the story we tell ourselves in those moments reveals something about us. Kay from Brandeis observes that there are two primary reactions, two divergent stories that Jews are telling about the Pittsburgh massacre this past year. For some, the murders in Pittsburgh and one in Poway are proof that America isn't different after all. They hate us there, they hate us here. Others, though, judge Pittsburgh not by the actions of one white supremacist or even the larger white nationalist milieu in which the killer carried out his attack. This other camp points to #ShowUpForShabbat, to the considerable and diverse crowd here at Beth Am the following Shabbos, and hundreds of synagogues around the country, actually around the world, who saw an outpouring of love and solidarity. For these people, America is unique for its philo-Semitism. One camp says, look at the proliferation of online hate speech, the rise in anti-Semitic incidents, the trolling of Jewish reporters. The other camp says, don't judge America by hateful media, judge it by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, whose front page headlines the Friday after the shooting included the first four words of Kaddish, Yitgadal v'Yitgadash Shemei Rabbah, in large Aramaic type. Or judged by the $15,000 Pulitzer reward money they donated to the Tree of Life Synagogue, or the millions raised from across the country for victims' families. But consider, just as Jews were not the only minority, or are not the only minority in the U.S. is not the only country in which we have been a minority. Didn't German Jews feel comfortable in Germany? Didn't French Jews feel accepted in Paris? Not really, you've been told. Not like us. And that's true to a point. There has never been a diaspora community quite like ours. And yet, let's take a look at France. What is the singular event of the 1890s that convinces Theodor Herzl to invent modern political Zionism? The Dreyfus Affair, of course. Herzl himself points to the experience of seeing Dreyfus publicly degraded as signaling the implausibility of European Judaism. Integration will ultimately fail, realizes Herzl, because, well, they'll hate us anyway. But here's the interesting thing. That is not the story many French Jewish nationals of the day are telling. Because Dreyfus is exonerated in 1906 and reinstated as a major in the French army. He serves the whole of World War I, ending his service with the rank of lieutenant colonel, and dies in 1935. What does the Dreyfus Affair mean to French Jews of his era? For many of them, it was the very opposite of Herzl's assessment. The project of liberalism will ultimately win the day. So perhaps the dual narrative of Jewish communities about Pittsburgh is not so uniquely American after all. What then are we to do? As we enter a new year, are we content with competing narratives? Do we need to reconcile them? I don't think the answer is simple, but here's my sense. For all our divisiveness, I believe fundamentally we are not multiple people with one body, but one people with multiple heads. And yes, each head is filled with ideas, and some are completely meshugana. But each Pesach, we manage to sit down at the Seder and tell our story. Arami Oved Avi, my father was a fugitive Aramean. We drosh it, we reinterpret it. And it is in the playfulness of that interpretive process that we honor our story. Those who say Pittsburgh means America is no different are not wrong. That doesn't mean they're entirely right, but they're not wrong. Those who say Pittsburgh means America is different are not wrong. That doesn't mean they're entirely right, but they're not wrong. And when we argue about where to locate ourselves in the tension, it's because at our core, in our kishkas, we know there's an us to locate. One final story with which Elie Wiesel opens his book, The Gates of the Forest. When the great Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. There he would light a fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Later, when his disciple, the celebrated Maggid of Mezrich, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, "Master of the universe, Ribono Shel Olam, listen. I don't know how to light the fire, but I am still able to say the prayer." And again, the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sassov, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and say, "I do not know how to light the fire. I do not know the prayer, but I know the place, and this must be sufficient." It was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. And then it fell finally to Rabbi Israel of Rizhin to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his armchair, his head in his hands, he spoke to God. "I am unable to light the fire, and I do not know the prayer. I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story. And this must be sufficient." And it was sufficient. Wiesel concludes, God made man because he loves stories. However, this moment, this Yom Kippur, in the aftermath of the single most violent attack in American Jewish history, is a call for us to be conscious about the stories we tell to ourselves, about ourselves. So much we forget, so much we struggle to recall how to light the fire, how to say the prayer, where in the forest we must go. But misfortune, as throughout our long history, has once again arrived at our door. Salvation, as it were, can only be achieved if we tell our story. So we'll tell it again and again in different voices, from different perspectives, sometimes with different conclusions. Hate crimes always begin with hateful stories. The response to hate and whatever actions we take must also begin with a story. We, Am Yisrael, are Am HaSipur, a nation of storytellers, and our story has carried us for thousands of years from the chains of Egypt to a land flowing with milk and honey, to each and every corner of the globe. It is our story. God loves us for it. It is sufficient. Shana Tova, Gamar Chatima Tova.